Everybody get up.
So, hello and welcome to another Webcast Friday here out of the studio in Offenbach at glueckkanja-gab. And today we want to continue our webcast series about the Azure Foundation. And I'm joined here by Matti Puolitaival out of our offices in Helsinki. Hello.
Hi, Patrick. Happy to be here again.
Great, super.
How are you doing, man?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's been a while, so I'm happy that we see each other again. So let's do another episode about our Azure Foundation.
Exactly.
Sounds great. Well, hello. My name is Patrick Treptau. I'm a cloud architect here at glueckkanja-gab, and I previously introduced Matti, which is, not only a consultant, but also one of our developers of the Azure Foundation itself, and has obviously a really good insight in what's been happening over the last couple of weeks. Well, actually, it's been already months ago. So maybe as a brief recap, let's review a little bit about the ins and outs of the Azure Foundation, meaning actually the basics of the Azure Foundation, of what's been used and what value it provides to our customers as well. So maybe we're just going to start again a little bit, just a couple of minutes through the basics for the ones that haven't actually watched our previous webcast before. So in a few words, Matti, what is the Azure Foundation?
Try to keep it short, but so basically it's a collection of Azure services that the typical customers should think about implementing when they are about to start their cloud journey. So things like setting up the organizational structure in form of management groups, organizing the different types of subscriptions together. The access management, so who gets access and where, and then the monitoring and logging for that. So keeping trail of who did changes and where and what changes, and then also in terms of an ongoing monitoring of the resources. So, for example, virtual machine monitoring and so forth.
So really a careful planning before you start your cloud journey, not also with the Azure Foundation or with Microsoft Azure, is key to success as well. Because some of the components, unlike with traditional on-premise environments, you cannot really change afterwards. For example, naming conventions and all that. So once you've deployed it, it's not that you're really locked into it, but it's very, very hard to make some really changes afterwards for the fundamental infrastructure, right?
Yeah, and the thing is that it's really easy to deploy, and like you said, harder to change afterwards. And these are things that you need to get right from the beginning in order to be successful in the cloud journey.
And I think one of the highlights in the Azure Foundation is that we provide that as infrastructure as a code. So we use actually Terraform as our basis for the deployment as well to perform like a stateful development and for continuous integration and development of our code base, right?
Yeah, it's fully based on Terraform code, custom developed solution by our team.
Great. So what value actually the Azure Foundation provides to a customer is really that we're going to bundle all of our experience, year-long experience together, have received feedback from the customer, but we also use the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework to kind of channel all the information into one comprehensive framework, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of distilled version of the Cloud Adoption Framework as well as our experience from the field. And we claim that it covers roughly 90% of the customer's needs, and where it doesn't, we can always customize and adapt for that part. So really a one solution that enables the customers a fast track to the cloud adoption.
And once I would decide to start my cloud adoption or my cloud journey with Microsoft Azure and with the Azure Foundation, we have some stages for actually the actual implementation. Maybe we'll just go briefly over that as well.
Yeah, so we've defined, or let's say distilled the process or deployment into 4 different stages. And it all starts from the parameterization, where we get together with the customers, IT experts, business experts, and go through the functionality of the Azure Foundation, explaining in detail the core functionalities, as well as then defining or designing together with the customer the implementation for them. And then as an outcome from that stage, we note all of the decisions into a decision log. And with that, the team of experts in the back office will then start the actual deployment of the solution to the customer's environment. That can be typically done in a matter of days, maybe a week, and then after that, it's we can have the handover trainings with the customer, and if the customer and then onboard the customer to the managed service as an optional step.
Great, super. Well, I mean, that was just really brief recap of, of the purpose of the Azure Foundation and the ins and outs and basics or so for it. Well, we haven't really stood still in the last couple of months. So what's new? What kind of development updates have we got for the last couple of months?
Yeah, well, there's quite a lot of stuff has happened in the development front as well. So I did a big quick calculation, and turns out that since the previous webcast, I think we've added more than 50,000 new lines of code into the product. And basically that equals to 10 to 15 enhancements delivered each month. So I guess I think this highlights the kind of the active development of the Azure Foundation, and also our promises our promise to our customers is that we'll keep the Azure Foundation always up to date, following the best practices as they evolve, implement new services as they are released and so forth.
Right, and as Microsoft Azure continues to evolve on a weekly, sometimes daily basis or so as well, we're going to keep up with the code base and trying to bring all those enhancements and all the new features or so to the Azure Foundation as well. Right. Yeah.
Well, change is a constant.
Right. And in addition, we listened to customer feedback, and I think one of the feedbacks of the customers was looking for an identity solution within the Azure Foundation, meaning, which we implemented in the last couple of months, is added an additional identity layer to the Azure Foundation, right?
Yeah. So this is one of the, let's say, most recent implementations. So we kind of completed the picture and added the previously missing identity layer. So briefly about the identity layer itself, basically the reality has shown that quite a lot of the customers are actually planning to extend their Active Directory, on-premise Active Directory domains to Azure Network as well. And basically that's the purpose of the identity layer, to be the placeholder for those valuable, critical Active Directory domain controller servers that would then handle the authentication authorization for the traditional workloads in Azure Network.
Right, exactly. And you mentioned traditional workloads because, if I kind of take a look and review Active Directory or so, it almost sounds a little bit like a legacy component compared to Azure Active Directory as well. But as you mentioned, some of the traditional and legacy components, still might not handle Azure AD authentication, and will require traditional Azure Kerberos authentication as well. Plus, we still have the need sometimes for group policies as well that cannot, for some features and functions or so that cannot be handled otherwise, for example.
Yeah, there's plenty of old workloads still running, and they have their requirements, and this is one way to address the requirement of the AD.
Super. In addition to that, we have another couple of set of notable updates that's been happening in between, right? Yeah,
so one of the other highlights to mention is the fact that we updated to the latest Azure AD provider, Terraform provider, which is nowadays based on Microsoft Graph. And with the Graph, it provides quite a lot of new possibilities in terms of what you can configure and set up and maintain with it instead of the old legacy Active Directory AP the provider was based on in the past. So that has seen quite an improvement on the capabilities that we can deploy to the Azure AD as a part of the Azure Foundation. And also with that, then we decided to revamp the role-based access control model for the setup. And brought in the persona model from Cloud Adoption Framework, So there would be personas for network operations, platform operations, data operations, security operations, etc. And they have their own predefined access management setup, granting them exactly the access they need and nothing more, kind of applying the principle of least privilege.
So we provided some more granularity for the RBAC permissions for that as well.
Yeah. For example, network team, they will need to have access to pretty much any subscription where you have a network, and the subscriptions are gonna placed throughout the management group tree, and instead of granting them network contributor at the top level or owner at the top level, we took it to the kind of a lower level and only apply or grant the permissions that they specifically need.
Great. And I think one of the other updates was we provided some more updates to the Azure Firewall functionality, right?
Yeah, that's also one of the highlights I wanted to mention. So we some time ago implemented also the Azure Firewall Manager into the Azure Foundation, and that's actually a product we are going to have a closer look today. So
sounds great.
Yeah.
Super. I'm looking forward to that. Well, I mean, this session today will focus about all the networking components in the Azure Foundation, and maybe just also as a brief recap of what we've done in the previous webcast. The Azure Foundation is a layered approach, right? So we're gonna continue and building up our foundation set layer by layer. And as you can see in the first webcast, we started actually with a launchpad and bootstrapping the environment. Then we continued up to the audit trail, which provided some activity logging and some, retention also for some crucial logging data as well. Then we went over to the Azure Foundations with all the different policies, setting up the management group infrastructures, your subscription and all that. And then we moved over to the platform management, which provides some of the automation, start, stop automation, update automation, and different Azure functions that we provide for some certain automating your Azure estate as well. And today we're going to cover layer 30 and layer 35, which means the actual networking components of the Azure Foundation. And obviously without any cloud, no networking without cloud. So, we have to connect to the remote resources as well. And we'll go a little bit more into detail about the different resources for that as well. So let's start. I think everyone knows this kind of principle about the traditional hub and spoke topology for the networking as well. Maybe we can go and review a little bit about that topology set, that a little bit before we're going to move any further into the new constructs for that as well.
Yeah, so we are going to cover the two kind of basic network topologies that are being used to set up the Azure networks. First one of them being the what we call traditional hub and spoke model, which is kind of the way how the networks have been set up in the Azure for the recent years, up until to the emerging virtual WAN, which we are also going to cover. So with the hub and spoke topology model, you basically have the hub, which centralizes the services, central network, and then you have the spoke networks, which are then connected to the hub via virtual network peering.
And I think we also have internally, we say that's a shared service actually as well, or a shared services network as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So basically that's the hub network is the place for centrally using those services. And the typical, let's say, use case for the traditional model is that if the customer is not looking to implement more than, let's say, one or a few regions, they don't need the full mesh connectivity between the Azure regions and the on-premises and so forth. This is still a really valid type of network setup to use in a smaller scale implementation.
Yeah. And if you go a little bit more into detail of what parts there are in that hub and spoke technology, we just mentioned that before earlier. We also called the hub the shared services network, and they are all shared components for not only for the Azure Foundation, but also for all the spoke networks where the actual workload sits. For example, what we just started with the identity layer, which we mentioned earlier, the domain controllers, which are consumed by workloads from our spoke networks as well. We have what we're going to cover in the next webcast, the whole Bastion infrastructure with different jump hosts for connecting to the infrastructure. We also have the application gateway. We have the Azure Firewall, which we're going to come later. So it really combines all the different shared services that's actually ready for consumption by the spoke networks, and then they are connected via so-called VNet peering to the hub network, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well said. So the idea is that you centralize the commonly used services into a single hub network, and then use them from the spokes through the virtual network peering.
Mm-hmm. Microsoft also listened to the customers as well, and this was a really, really good environment or topology, what you mentioned earlier, if you don't have a whole lot of regional sites or actually breakout offices or that, where if you're a rapidly growing enterprise that continuously expands and maybe on a very rapid scale expands with different branch offices as well. So about a year and a half ago, we started using already and looking into the virtual WAN topology. And maybe we're just going to go a little bit over the differences between the traditional hub and spoke topology versus the virtual WAN topology as well that we now offer within the Azure Foundation.
Yeah. So basically what the virtual WAN is that it's a Microsoft's SD-WAN solution, provides full mesh connectivity between the different Azure regions as well as the on-premises. So you can use it as a kind of a transit network from different branch offices to another. And basically it's the intended use case is kind of a large network setups, especially if you're planning to, or the customer is planning to utilize lots of different regions, and also can be a valid alternative for those traditional MPLS lines as a replacement for those.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned that with the transitional networking is that you are actually able, which you cannot do with the hub and spoke technology in itself, actually a remote office is capable to connect to another remote office, vice versa with the virtual WAN infrastructure as well.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
And I think one of the other huge advantages for that is if you have multiple regions as well, they are both connected via the Microsoft backbone, and meaning like the fiber, the really high-speed fiber optic network links that provides really, really low latency and response time between the different sites as well. So if we're going to take a look again at the virtual WAN topology, I think one of the most really important aspects of any topology as well is also the on-premise connectivity as well. But also we have what we're going to cover a little bit later. We'll have the additional feature of a so-called secured virtual hub as well. And that means that we can additionally secure that hub with an Azure Firewall, which we're going to cover later, or some security appliances like from Zscaler, for example. Yep.
So basically, if we summarize the virtual WAN topology in short, so the virtual WAN itself is a kind of the umbrella resource that collects all the network connectivity setups together. And in terms of the connecting to the Azure networks, there are the regional virtual hubs in which you like you mentioned, you can place the firewall directly within the virtual hub to apply the traffic filtering and control. And then the hubs are also the connection places for the on-premise connectivity. So whether the customer is using site-to-site VPN tunnels or ExpressRoutes, those are also terminated in these hubs.
And you mentioned on-premise connectivity. Because it's an SD-WAN configuration as well, which means software defined as well, it's very easy to kind of onboard some of the remote sites as well. And we're going to kind of cover all the different connectivity methods or so that we have, I think, in the next couple of slides as well.
Yeah.
So on-premise connectivity is crucial also for an environment because, well, you don't want to live in an Azure-only bubble as well. You do need to have some connectivity in order to, let's say, quote-unquote, dial into the Azure environment as well. And I think one of the most common used to be, or actually kind of still is a little bit, of, well, maybe for smaller environments or smaller customers as well, is the site-to-site VPN connection, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the site-to-site VPN, that's the, let's say, the easiest way to start setting up the hybrid connectivity between the on-premises and the networks. And basically, well, it is based on VPN technologies. So chances are the customer already has devices available which in their network which they can use to connect to the Azure network. They establish a secure connection using the IPsec or secure connection with the IPsec tunnel, and with that they get the network level access to the Azure private networks. And the site-to-site VPN, yeah, it is fast to set up. It's a really good solution for if you need on-premise connectivity or hybrid connectivity for development, test lab environments, or for smaller customers, maybe even for the production workloads. Because, well, you can also set up an active site-to-site VPN, so you have the redundancy built into that as well.
Exactly. I think one of the drawbacks of a site-to-site VPN connection is kind of the latency as well, because, well, once your traffic actually leaves your edge router as well, or actually the Microsoft environment, it is routed in a traditional VPN manner through the public internet and through the public different routes until it arrives, and you really don't have a whole lot of control over the routing or the packaging or how the packets actually traverse the internet. And actually to overcome all those maybe potential latency issues and also bandwidth issues as well, because we do have some bandwidth, let's say, limitations also on the VPN side as well in Microsoft Azure, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to consume the entire bandwidth directly or see the actual bandwidth traversing the entire link. So I guess the upgrade towards that, or the more mature version, would be the ExpressRoute, right?
Yeah. So, well, like you mentioned, the ExpressRoute is then to cover those drawbacks of the site-to-site VPN, the public traversal of the traffic over links that you can't control. So there could be issues along the way on the path for the site-to-site VPN, which then kind of are resolved in the ExpressRoute. So ExpressRoute is a dedicated connection between the customer's network and the Microsoft network, utilizing the customer's network provider connectivity, and it's a layer 3 solution. And, well, it's a private connection between the customer's network and the Microsoft network.
So it's pretty much just one hop directly into the Microsoft data center or infrastructure as well. So while you can actually configure the site-to-site VPN connections, now I think that's one of the, also for me, one of the biggest improvements as well. You can configure that as infrastructure as a code. You can do that with the ExpressRoute as well, but it's not as simple as putting it into code. You have still to talk to the service provider as well and get the connection up and running, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it involves also the network provider as well. So you need to source the circuits from the provider in addition to just setting up the ExpressRoute from portal. So takes a considerably lot of more time and effort to set up than the site-to-site VPN.
Right, but in return you get pretty much 2 lines or so, 2 circuits directly into the Azure data center as well. And I think one of the advantages also is you can still use site-to-site VPN as a backup, for example. So you can mix and match all the different connectivity, on-premise connectivity methods.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can still use the site-to-site VPN for other sites. So let's say you have smaller remote sites, you can still use the site-to-site VPN to connect those, but then use the ExpressRoute from headquarters or regional offices.
Right. Another thing that we've seen also, of course, during the pandemic as well, is the requirements to work from a home office as well. And that sometimes involves even some legacy method as, for example, a point-to-site VPN, which means with a piece of software, you dial into a remote environment as well, right?
Yeah, so the point-to-site VPN is a VPN solution for single devices, meaning remote workers' laptop, for example. And basically utilizes the same technology that the site-to-site VPN does. And with that, you get the dedicated or private connection from the laptop somewhere out in the wild to the Azure network.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's still kind of a legacy method. I think the more mature method and modern method that we probably would recommend for a customer would be, for example, an Azure Virtual Desktop environment without the let's see, legacy VPN connections for that as well.
Yeah, certainly there are alternatives for or let's say better alternatives for the point-to-site, like AVD as you mentioned. But still, if there's the need, there's also a solution for that use case.
Exactly. Yeah. I think one of the other key components to the Azure Foundation is what we mentioned earlier, and that's the Azure Firewall. You know, it's why would an Azure network will be different from an on-premises network? I think I've never really seen an on-premises network with a centralized firewall, and we have pretty much the same construct in Microsoft Azure, right? And also in the Azure Foundation.
Yeah, well, in that regard, the Azure networks are not different than the on-premise network. So you need to know who's talking to whom within the Azure network as well, and that's where the Azure Firewall kind of solves that issue for you. So it's cloud-native firewall device. Microsoft takes care of managing all the underlying resources. The only thing you see is basically the rule sets that you configure. And that's it. Anything else will be taken care of by Microsoft.
And it's highly redundant by itself. And I think the bandwidth, that's capable bandwidth, is quite huge, right?
Yeah, I think it's like 30 gigabits per second or so. So should be plenty.
Well, that's certainly plenty now for most customers as well. I think one of the differences between a traditional firewall and the Azure Firewall is also some capabilities about netting, exposing public IPs as well, and so-called application rules. Maybe we can go over the details of that a little bit more as well.
Yeah, so what the application rules add are basically firewall rules that are based on the FQDNs instead of IPs like on the traditional firewalls.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing to highlight with the Azure Firewall that it's a zero trust policy and traffic is denied by default unless you open a port or, for example, a URL, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. The Azure Firewall also comes in two SKUs. You know, that's what we have. What we look at here. That's the standard SKU that has all the functionality for the exposing of public IPs, for the traditional network rules, and for the application rules. But we also have a premium SKU for the Azure Firewall, which includes some of the more advanced features, right?
Yeah. So the premium SKU builds on top of the already kind of nice feature set of the standard firewall by adding the TLS inspection. So turning the light on also on what type of traffic goes in and comes out from the firewall. Then adds the IDPS capabilities or enhances the IDPS capabilities. Adds the URL filtering capability, and then I think one of the my favorites are the web categories. So instead of creating rules based on FQDNs, you can actually allow traffic based on the category of the site.
Exactly. For example, malicious websites, gambling sites, or something like that. Different categories like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a really cool feature for the AVD workloads, for example, allowing you to dictate that the business users can actually access the productive sites and then blocking the malicious or time-wasting sites, so to say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we talked before about the Microsoft Virtual WAN, and within the Virtual WAN, you can have multiple for each region virtual hubs as well. And each virtual hub is compromised or has ideally an Azure Firewall as part of the topology for that as well. So another thing that we also now implemented with the Azure Foundation is the capabilities of the Azure Firewall Manager, meaning that we have, for example, we go a little bit more into detail, that hierarchical rules, a rule set, and we have a single pane of glass where we're going to manage different firewall rules in different regions with a single interface, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, so it's a kind of a single pane of glass solution for managing all of the firewalls, regardless of how many and in which regions, from a central place. And the benefit, or let's say the nice feature of the firewall manager is the support for the hierarchical policies. So you can create global policies that rules that or firewall rules that should be applied to all of the firewalls regardless of the region, and then have those inherited into the local policies, and basically, well, having a global rule set for all of the firewalls.
And it also provides support from some third-party security providers like Zscaler, like Checkpoint or iBoss as well, which provides a highly implemented or highly virtualized implementation and a very easy implementation for that as well as a third-party security provider in addition to the Azure Firewall as well, right? Well, once we go into a little bit more into detail, a whole lot of services in Microsoft Azure are publicly exposed to begin with. And we have some, well, in the beginning, we have some Azure native DNS resolution, but now also in the Azure Foundation, it's been there already for a little while, we also have private DNS resolution. Maybe we'll go a little bit more into detail for that as well.
Yeah. So, well, DNS, we all know it's crucial. It's prone to fail, and typically, if you have connectivity issues, the DNS is to blame.
Yeah.
But well, let's try to take a positive note on this. So the Azure private DNS zones are well, basically allows you to take your own DNS naming into Azure. So setting up the DNS zones as you want, with the naming as you want. And from configuration-wise, there's pretty much nothing else than just connecting the private DNS zone to the network, and after that, the devices connecting to the network will register their names, and the others you can then query the IPs of those resources from the zone.
Exactly, and you have the auto registration feature as well. So once a new resource is detected in that particular network that you have connected to, it's automatically registered as a DNSA record or so in the private DNS zone, right?
Exactly.
And I think it's also used for scenarios which we also implemented in the Azure Foundation recently. It's the private link feature. And I think that's, I'm pretty excited about that, because I remember the early days of Microsoft Azure when you had to provide, for example, a SQL database. And it still is a really good software as a service, but I think the only backdraw was that it was publicly accessible. It has a public URL with a public IP address attached to that as well. And now with the private link functionality and private endpoints, you can kind of bring in those resources, like inherently public resources like storage accounts or app services, for example, or some of the other PaaS services like SQL databases into and integrate them in your own virtual network infrastructure, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that really makes a big difference. Also in terms of security, you can assign them a private IP address from your private network range as well. And so bring those resources that are usually outside of any virtual network, you can kind of bring them in and tie them into your network topology as well.
Yeah. And well, the private DNS zone has a crucial role on that setup. So once you connect a resource to the network through the private link, that will register the name into the private DNS zone with the name of the resource, and basically with that you can then locate or based on that DNS resource record, you can then locate the resource from the network, even from on-premise.
Exactly, and it just really adds a private link to the public URL. If it's like blob.core.windows.net or so, it will kind of put as a prefix or so a private link or so on top of that.
Exactly.
So if you're going to stay at DNS resolution as well, I mean, there's still, we have a whole lot of different scenarios in how we can provide DNS resolution in Microsoft Azure. Some of the customers choose just to have one DNS zone hosted on-premise, for example, maybe even as part of their Azure Active Directory infrastructure as well. We also know, highlighted before with the identity layer, we can provide Active Directory plus optional DNS in Microsoft Azure. But we still it's not really a problem, but we still maybe want to split up some of the DNS traffic or so between those two entities and maybe even highlight or differentiate between Azure resources and on-prem resources as well. And that's why we've implemented in the Azure Foundation a so-called DNS Relay, right?
Yeah. So what the DNS Relay does, like the name suggests, it's basically, it takes the role of forwarding the DNS queries to the endpoint that can actually resolve them. So let's say you have an Azure VM who needs to locate a VM in the on-premise. It sends a DNS query to the DNS Relay. DNS Relay recognizes that, hey, this VM is querying for a record from the on-premise based domain DNS zone, and then forwards it to the correct DNS server somewhere in the on-premise or in the identity network.
And I think one of the benefits is that not every DNS query has to traverse. For example, if you're utilizing you want to have DNS resolution for your DNS zone that you're hosting on-premise, that not every DNS lookup needs to traverse a VPN connection. And you can use, for example, the private DNS zone that we've covered earlier. Well.
Exactly, yeah, and works also vice versa to the previous example. So you have a on-premise resource trying to locate a storage account that has been connected to the Azure network. It will create a DNS query. The query gets forwarded to the DNS Relay, which then provides the private IP address of the storage account back to the on-premise resource.
So, but I understand the DNS Relay is not a native Microsoft solution or a product or resource in Microsoft Azure. That's something that we've developed as part of the Azure Foundation, right?
Yeah, that's something we've developed out of the necessity, so to say. So we identified the need for such a solution due to such a solution not being natively available. But like always, it's always subject to kind of review. Should there be a cloud native solution come available at a later point.
And all of those networking components that we've discussed today, they're all capable of being parameterized, meaning that we can provide that all with infrastructure as a code, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that we discussed today will be provided from our infrastructure code solution based on Terraform and tailored to the customer's needs.
Super. Well, wonderful. I think we've kind of covered quite a lot or so with all the different networking components today, and I understand it's been quite a lot of topics or so. I mean, we can probably still talk about it in an hour or hours an hour at a time. So if you have any additional questions or so, feel free to comment or feel free to contact us at our email addresses or contact us over LinkedIn as well. Well, Matti, we're already at the end of the podcast. Not podcast, it's a webcast, because we're not only on audio, we're on video, right? Yeah. So it's been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the next webcast with you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. It's been a pleasure.
What's on the agenda for the next webcast?
I think we could do something on the app zones. I think that's something we haven't covered as of yet.
Oh, cool.
So
maybe you can
tune in for good content later on as well.
Good. I'm looking forward to it. So good to be here. Good to have you, and I'm looking forward to the next webcast. Well, have a great rest of your Friday, and I'm looking forward to the next webcast, and be safe and be good, and I will see you the next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.